Mon nom c'est Michel, puis je vais vous présenter deux poèmes. Puis j'ai décidé de choisir deux différents qui me représentent. Puis ce qui arrive, c'est que j'ai deux styles. J'ai Fantasy, qui est le premier que je vais présenter. Puis j'ai plus considération, comme te faire penser. Fait, mon premier, c'est intitulé Le pianiste. Je t'entends de l'autre salle, la curiosité monte. Je me rends à ton côté, tes mains se rencontrent au centre. Les doigts qui bougent au rythme, chaque note perfectionnée. Je chante ta belle chanson, répare mon cœur cassé. Nous harmonisons maintenant, l'un après l'autre ils viennent. Mais je ne vois personne et n'entends que toi qui règnes. Cette chambre emplie de joie, un moment spontané, une heure qui passe infinie, une journée d'une courte durée. Tu ralentis doucement, la fin du bonheur instant, mais entends ma demande et jour rythme des pas. Ça a été inspiré de quelqu'un qui a juste joué le piano, puis j'ai vraiment aimé ça, puis ça m'a juste fait rêver. Ouais. Puis mon deuxième, c'est notre vie de tous les jours. Chaque jour, on se réveille, 1 million de pensées. La moitié d'elles sont tristes, mais cela peut toujours changer. Nous vivons dans un état de désastre, des personnes faites de papier. Quand allons-nous vivre nos vies et fondre nos cœurs d'acier? Nous n'avons qu'affronter nos peurs, ce n'est qu'une simple action. Mais l'insécurité nous guide et nous perdons l'attention. Merci.
Just kidding. Thanks for having me here. I wrote like a frenzy for this festival, but you know what they say, fourth time's a charm, so let's get started. He had always loved the cold. He had no idea why. If you had to guess, he'd say it's the way that it just wraps around you, stings your skin. There's no way to ignore the cold and the rain. It's a beautiful thing, rain is, the way it falls drop by drop. One can't tell where the next drop will fall. When you combine the two, it's like a symphony. When he had heard the forecast, he couldn't help but feel excited. It was supposed to rain steadily for the next couple of days. Winter was beginning to end, but the cold still hung in the air. He came home after school and tried to endure the house as long as he could. He grabbed the thin sweater and put it on. It was close to dinner time when he decided to leave. The rain hadn't really picked up yet. Everything was still covered in water from the afternoon drizzle. He crossed the street, put his hands in his pockets, and he began to walk. The sun wasn't visible through the gray sky, but it was easy to tell that darkness was quickly approaching. He began to think about his life. He began to dream. He dreamt of the future, a future where he was completely happy. He wasn't sure exactly where that place was. He tried thinking of the near future, perhaps leaving home to further his studies at university would bring him some happiness. He began to wonder what he would become. He walked for some time, walked underneath some trees overlooking the sidewalk. He felt a large drop of rain fall on his head, stirring him from his thoughts. He attempted to go back to his thoughts about his future, yet was unable. All he could think about was how all the other kids at school knew where they were going, who they were going with, and what they would become. He, on the other hand, couldn't figure out if he could even go to university at all. The more he pondered his future, the more depressed he got. He hadn't even realized how dark it was getting. It was considerably darker than it was when he first began his walk. The rain had picked up a little, and it was a little colder. He was beginning to feel the cold cut through his sweater and bite at his skin. The light rain had begun to soak through his hair, and the breeze was blowing the wet stringy strands onto his face. Lights had begun to turn on in people's windows as families gathered together, either preparing for a meal or beginning to spend some time together. Perhaps they were all gathering on the couch to enjoy some television together in the warmth of their living rooms. He averted his eyes from the houses back to his feet, watching each step he took. He began to think of schooling again, except this time his thoughts weren't so nice. He began to think about how his grades had dropped recently. His teachers, who had been with him from the beginning of the year, were curious and wondered why his grades had been steadily decreasing. He had heard from some of his teachers talking about it one day. No one ever confronted him about it, though. He couldn't focus like he used to. The classes he had previously enjoyed just seemed to drag on. His teachers would look out only to see his blank face, either staring at his desk or looking off in another direction. It was obvious his attention was somewhere else. The sudden damp coldness from his right foot stuck a thorn into his thoughts. He had unknowingly just stepped into a puddle. He felt the cold rainwater seep through his shoes. The cold worked in unison with the water to plague his foot with an extreme coldness, but he didn't mind, and he continued to walk. The rain continued to increase, and the small puddles began to grow as the rain splashed into each in unison. His friends began to see a change as well, he could tell. He didn't hang out as much as he used to. He didn't talk as much as he used to, didn't laugh as much either. He didn't seem to be all there sometimes. He got worse and worse as the days went on, and he knew it. His friends started to wonder what he did after school, as they never saw him. The gap between his life after school and his life at school began to widen between him and his friends. Even though they realized something was wrong and he wasn't talking about it, none of them ever asked him or tried to get to the root of the problem. They ignored it and continued on with their schedules and routines. The residue from the splash of water on his face brought his thoughts back into reality. A car had driven through a puddle near him, sending a wave of cold rainwater in his direction. If he had been just a foot farther ahead, he would have been completely soaked. The driver continued down his path, out of ignorance of the entire occurrence. He thought that this would be the best spot to turn around. The walk back was going to be a lot harder than he thought. The rain had really begun to pick up, and it was really starting to come down pretty hard. The wind that had been at his back the whole time was now blowing into his face. His cheeks began to turn pink and his ears began to sting. As he walked back, he felt his nose begin to run. He wasn't sure if it was snot or rainwater dripping from the end of his nose, but he didn't care. He continued to walk back. At home, he was constantly harassed by his parents' consistent nagging. They had noticed on his last report card that his grades had begun to drop. They continually brought it up and even threatened him in an attempt to make him do better. He wasn't allowed to hang out after school anymore. He wasn't allowed to go to local events. His computer time had been reduced to homework only. But none of that compared to what they had done recently. They had taken away his music. Music, the thing that humans had used long before computers for entertainment. Music had been the center of human entertainment for decades. He couldn't contain his anger. When he got home from school, he ignored his parents' pesterings, and he just left without saying a word. He had heard his stepfather yelling something at him as he left the house, but it didn't matter to him. He didn't want to return home, but he knew that he had to. He was thankful, incredibly thankful, for the rain. In the rain, there was no one else walking with him. His stepfather didn't care enough to chase after him. The rain meant that he could be in peace, with no one but the cars that just passed by without a care. He wished that he never had to go home, that this time would last forever. Night approached. A great darkness had consumed the sky. Cars' headlights zoomed past. The rain had begun to pour, soaking everything. He had become drenched, but it didn't matter. The cold made him forget about all his problems. The walk had done what he had hoped. He was finally able to put his mind at ease, if only for a moment. He rounded a corner, and his heart sunk when he saw his house at the end of the street. The lights from his house didn't signify a harmony within the family as he imagined with the other houses. Instead, they were glowing like eyes of a monster. Rain splashed all around him. Puddles were spreading across the entirety of the sidewalk. There was no avoiding the water. Both of his feet were drenched along with the bottoms of his pants. The rain had soaked through all layers of his clothing, and he felt a tremendous numbing throughout his body. The sounds of the busy city were far behind him. He walked up the driveway of his home. He began to hear the sounds of his stepfather yelling. Apparently, in his absence, his stepfather had vented his anger from him to his mother. He heard something shatter. He wasn't sure if it was a vase or if it was a plate. He continued down the wet driveway, stopping just in front of the door. He took a deep breath, preparing himself to step out of the cold and into the fires of hell. Thanks for coming out. It really does mean a lot to all of us.